Good morning. Good morning. We hope you all rested well and had a successful day yesterday. This is a wonderful time of year for all of us who are associated with Brigham Young University and the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. We welcome you to this first plenary session of the morning. And my name is Gary Doxey. I'm an associate director of the center here. And let me introduce the panel we have today. Our topic is Dignity, Religious Traditions, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have speakers. We will begin with Asma Uddin, who is the senior scholar for religious freedom at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute in Washington, D.C. Asma is a friend of our center. We've been associated on numerous occasions in various events, and we're grateful to have her with us. Also, our good friend Mohammed Haroun, who is a professor at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies of the University of Botswana. Mohammed is, I have to say, one of the most articulate individuals I've met on the topic of law and religion and religious freedom, religious studies from Africa, in Africa. He's a leader in the African Consortium of Law and Religion Studies, and we're grateful for our association with him, which is also an association that extends over many years. I'm also pleased to introduce my colleague, Professor Brett Scharss, who really needs no introduction. He's been able to speak to you already a few times, but he is a brilliant scholar and the director of our International Center for Law and Religion Studies here at BYU. Prior to hearing from each of them, and we'll hear from them in the order as presented, let me just make one quick announcement. You may have noticed outside this room, in the hallways, there are some paintings representing various religious traditions. I hope you've taken a moment just to see some of those. These paintings were commissioned for the 2002 Winter Olympic Games as part of the celebration, and it was really a celebration of faith and of multiculturalism that was celebrated simultaneously with the Olympic Games. We are pleased that the collection of paintings has actually come in as a gift to the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. So we're pleased to be able to show these paintings here. As you go around and look at them, you'll see so many different religious traditions represented by an artist in a similar style, but with the symbolism and some of the tradition represented distinctly for each religion. Some of the paintings are on display in our offices, and you'll see in place of those paintings, you'll see a photograph of those paintings, but you're welcome to go upstairs one floor to our offices and see the originals if you would like. I'm also pleased to say that for all of the delegates here, those who have been invited to present and have been so gracious to us, we have a book that contains these paintings that we would like you to take home with you. Your name is on the book. They will be outside of this room on tables, and students will assist you in obtaining a copy of that book. Also, our International Advisory Council, if you don't already have a copy of the book, we've got some copies for you. And if we've left some people out and you would like a copy, if we have sufficient copies, we'd like to give it to you. So just there's a sign-up sheet. You can put your name down and we'll try to make sure you get a copy as well. But we hope you take advantage of that as a nice souvenir and also an interesting representation, beautiful representation of the many, many religious traditions depicted in those paintings. So with that, we'll proceed with our panel. We'll try to maintain some time at the end for question and answer, and we'll go in the order as presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for your kind introduction, and to BYU for inviting me to present here today. I've been in this fight for religious freedom for more than a decade now, and the principle that runs throughout my work is this idea that everyone has the right to be wrong. It's a phrase that was coined by the founder of the Becket Fund, where I worked for 7 years. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of religious liberty is that it protects people of all faiths, even if their beliefs seem unfounded, flawed, implausible, or downright silly. It's not that religious freedom requires relativism or indifference to truth. Instead, it's based on an understanding of the religious quest, searching for answers to ultimate questions and living in accordance with one's authentic beliefs. What was that? That journey is different for everyone, both among religious communities and among members of the same community. We may think that another's belief is wrong, but again, the premise behind religious freedom is that people have the right to be wrong. It is a concept inherently rooted in human dignity, because what matters isn't whether your beliefs are acceptable to the majority. You don't have to earn your rights or prove yourself worthy of them. Simply by virtue of being a human, you have access to human rights, including the fundamental human right to religious liberty. And yet, in religious freedom discourse today, the principle of human dignity is sorely lacking. No one has the right to be wrong, it seems. They can only be right, and you, the beholder, get to decide what is right. We see this in a number of different areas of popular political and legal discourse. But one area that I've been looking at closely has to do with the rights of American Muslims. In question for a lot of Americans, including very powerful, influential Americans, is whether Muslims are protected by religious liberty. In other words, they are questioning whether Muslims can access rights under the First Amendment, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Increasingly, we hear arguments made both in the courts of law and the courts of public opinion that Islam is not a religion, that it is instead a dangerous political ideology hell-bent on taking over the United States and subverting fundamental human rights. Islam is an almost otherworldly bogeyman, a larger-than-life, all-consuming swamp creature. And in the process of stopping it, its opponents run roughshod over the human rights of everyday human beings who happen to be Muslim. For these people, again, powerful, influential people, Muslims are somehow not human enough for human rights. So who are these opponents? First, consider some general statistics on the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment. An August 2017 poll by the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania found that almost 1 in 5 Americans believe that under the U.S. Constitution, American Muslims do not have the same rights as other American citizens. A 2016 survey by the Pew Research Center found that almost half of all U.S. adults believe that some American Muslims are anti-American. This number includes 11% who thinks that most or almost all American Muslims are anti-American. A 2015 poll by the Associated Press and the NORC Center for Public Affairs Research found that Americans favor protecting religious liberty for Christians over other faith groups, ranking Muslims as the least deserving of the right. 82% voted in favor of protecting religious liberty for Christians, while only 61% said the same for Muslims. The general climate of anti-Muslim bias correlates with a sharp rise in hate crimes. A hate crime is defined as a criminal offense motivated by race, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender, or gender identity. Anti-Muslim hate crimes are the fastest growing religious hate crimes, roughly doubling from 2014 to 2016. According to FBI data, in 2015, anti-Muslim hate crimes went from 154 to 257, which is a 67% increase. Between 2015 and 2016, the number of assaults against Muslims surpassed the number of assaults in 2001, the year of the 9/11 attacks. 127 reported assaults in 2016 compared to 93 in 2001. If you add other hate crimes to the mix, such as intimidation, vandalism, etc., the 2016 total comes to 307. This data was collected from approximately 15,000 law enforcement agencies that participate voluntarily, which according to experts means that the actual number of hate crimes is probably much higher. In addition to these hate crimes, more than 42% of Muslim children in grades K through 12 have experienced some type of bullying because of their faith. The rise in anti-Muslim sentiment and hate crimes, both rooted in the idea that Muslims are somehow less human or less deserving of human rights, and religious liberty specifically, is happening at a time when religious liberty is one of the most important items on the Trump administration's agenda. Even during the 2016 election, presidential candidate Ted Cruz called the election the religious liberty election, stating that religious liberty issues were front and center in determining who the next president would be. Candidate Trump promised on the campaign trail that the first priority of my administration will be to preserve and protect our religious liberty. And indeed, President Trump has kept his promise by offering expansive religious liberty protections, from opening the new Conscience and Religious Freedom Division at the Department of Health and Human Services, to issuing broad religious liberty guidance and instituting the Religious Liberty Task Force at the Department of Justice. The Department of Education has also announced its desire to change rules that prohibit federal education funding for faith-based entities, and has reopened the public comment period to begin the process. And in July, as you may be aware, the State Department held a multi-day ministerial to advance religious freedom, where Secretary Pompeo issued the Potomac Declaration and the Potomac Plan of Action, which, according to Pompeo, reassert the United States' unwavering commitment to promoting and defending religious freedom and recommend concrete ways that international community and governments can do more to protect religious freedom and vulnerable religious communities. So on the one hand, we've seen major steps forward for religious liberty, as championed by particular groups, in particular conservative Christians. And on the other hand, there's a growing climate of anti-Muslim sentiment and hate crimes, and the growing salience of the argument that Islam is not a religion and most Muslims don't deserve religious liberty. Even as Cruz and Trump were rallying for religious freedom on the campaign trail, they were proposing staunchly anti-Muslim measures. Trump promised to establish a database to track Muslims and suggested shutting down mosques. And Ted Cruz advocated for surveilling Muslim neighborhoods. Other presidential candidates chimed in too. Ben Carson declared that a Muslim absolutely could not be president, and Rick Santorum said that the U.S. Constitution does not protect Muslims because Islam is different from Christianity. Consider also some of the Trump administration's appointees and their positions on Islam. In 2016, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn told an Act for America conference in Dallas that Islam is a political ideology that, quote, hides behind the notion of it being a religion. In 2017, then White House aide Sebastian Gorka could not unequivocally state that Islam is a religion. When he was asked by Stephen Inskeep of NPR, does the president believe Islam is a religion? Gorka failed to give a direct answer, instead opining, this is not a theological seminary, this is the White House. We aren't going to get into theological debates. If the president has a certain attitude to a certain religion, you can ask him. We are talking about national security and totalitarian ideologies that drive the threats. Steve Bannon, the White House chief strategist who helped design and implement President Trump's executive order banning entry into the U.S. of citizens of 7 Muslim-majority countries, once mocked former President George W. Bush for stating that Islam is a religion of peace. According to Bannon, Islam is not a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of submission. Islam means submission. In May 2018, Frank Fleets, who was named Chief of Staff for President Trump's National Security Council, was formerly the Vice President of the strongly anti-Muslim Center for Security Policy, and has claimed that Muslim communities in America are susceptible to, quote, a radical worldview that wants to destroy modern society, create a global caliphate, and impose Sharia law on everyone on earth. So in April, BuzzFeed News reported that since 2015, Republican officials in 49 states have publicly attacked Islam, some even questioning its legitimacy as a religion. So here are some of the examples that BuzzFeed News offered. An Oklahoma State Representative, John Bennett, in 2014 called Islam a cancer, and last year met with Muslim constituents only after they filled out questionnaires asking whether they beat their wives. Bennett has also said that Islam is not even a religion, it's a social political system that uses a deity to advance its agenda of global conquest. A Nebraska State Senator, Bill Kintner, proposed that Muslims be required to eat pork if they wish to enter the United States. A state senator in Rhode Island wrote that Muslim religion and philosophy is to murder, rape, and decapitate anyone who is a non-Muslim, and recommended that Syrian refugees be housed in camps. In January, a South Dakota state senator, who was at the time running for the United States House, questioned whether the First Amendment applies to Muslims, asking in a press release, does our Constitution offer protections and rights to a person who believes in the full implementation of Islamic law as practiced by 14 Islamic countries and millions of Muslims who believe in the deadly political ideology that believes you should be killed for leaving Islam? And Jody Hice, a 2014 Republican congressional candidate from Georgia, questioned the compatibility of Islam with the American Constitution and wrote in 2012 that Islam would not qualify for First Amendment protection since it is a geopolitical system, in his words. A friend of mine who works with state legislatures to form bipartisan religious freedom caucuses affirms that BuzzFeed's findings reflect a general trend. This is what he told me. In my initial meetings with lawmakers, I would try to explain briefly the general threats facing religious freedom in the United States and why it would be prudent for lawmakers to begin to think strategically and collectively about these issues. On a surprising number of occasions, lawmakers raised with me their concerns about Islam. Some, I would say numbering between 7 and 10, raised with me the issue of whether we should be seeking to pass legislation banning Sharia law. I also had an equal number of lawmakers raise with me the question of whether Islam is even a religion deserving First Amendment protection. I estimate that approximately 5 to 10% of state lawmakers hold to some version of the Islam is not a religion belief. All of the lawmakers were Republicans, none were senior level members of legislative leadership, but none were known in advance to be quote unquote bomb throwers, who I generally avoided at that point anyway. This lopsided view of religious liberty has, of course, not gone unnoticed, and the media has reported on the failure of many religious liberty advocates to demand coherence. In a 2015 piece titled When Muslims Are the Target, Prominent Religious Freedom Advocates Largely Go Quiet, the Washington Post's Michelle Borstein wrote about the relative silence from the religious liberty camp when Republican presidential candidates made shocking statement after statement denying Muslims their civil rights. Tom Gelton of National Public Radio also wrote a piece that year titled Conservatives Call for Religious Freedom, but for whom? In April 2017, Peter Biner wrote about the phenomenon for The Atlantic in a piece called When Conservatives Oppose Religious Freedom. And just a few weeks ago, Catherine Stewart asked the same question in an op-ed in the New York Times called, Whose religious liberty is it anyway? And I too called it out in my New York Times op-ed from both a couple weeks ago and a couple months ago. After the Supreme Court's decision on the travel ban case, Michelle Borstein of the Washington Post considered the difference in the way religious liberty advocates responded to the Masterpiece Cake Shop holding versus the travel ban decision. So to give you some background on those cases, on June 4th, 2018, the court had ruled in Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado Civil Rights Commission, a case that involved Jack Phillips, a Christian baker who refused on religious grounds to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple. The court ruled 7-2 in favor of the Christian baker, holding that the Civil Rights Commission, in reviewing the gay couple's complaint against the baker, had treated religion with overt hostility, at one point even comparing Phillips to Nazis. This, the court held, was unacceptable. Religion under the U.S. Constitution cannot be treated with so much contempt. The court said the Commission's hostility was inconsistent with the First Amendment's guarantee that our laws will be applied in a manner that is neutral toward religion. And yet, just 3 weeks later, the court's majority utterly failed to comprehend the gravity of the president's animus against Muslims. It upheld the travel ban despite evidence of prejudice far more egregious than the evidence in Masterpiece. The all-importance of national security pushed the court to defer to the president almost completely. Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg argued in their dissent, however, that the extreme deference was unwarranted where the prejudice was so strong. National security was mere window dressing, they said. That try as it might, just could not conceal the obvious fact that the ban was steeped in impermissible discriminatory animus against Islam and its followers. Regardless of whether one agrees with the dissent's view of the law, what is relevant here is how the public, and especially American Muslims, received the opinion and how it understood the contrast between the two holdings. Michelle Borstein wrote a piece called Why Many Religious Liberty Groups Are Silent About the Supreme Court's Decision on President Trump's Travel Ban. She took to task the religious liberty groups that celebrated Phillips's win in Masterpiece, but failed to decry the travel ban decision to say anything at all. Even if the religious liberty groups agreed with the outcome based on the law, and I can see that, why didn't they say anything about the overt anti-Muslim hostility that was necessarily wrapped up in the public discourse about the case? Even if the law required the justices to rule the way they did, there are avenues to change the law. Why didn't religious liberty advocates say anything about that? In her article, Borstein wrote, the difference in response raises new questions about what precisely is meant by religious liberty in America today. Indeed, the very definition of religious liberty is the biggest question facing the First Amendment. Does it apply to all Americans equally? So it's bad enough when politicians argue that Islam is not a religion. But what is really scary for me is when this bogus argument moves from the political to the legal arena. That's what we're seeing in the US today, particularly in the land use context, involving either construction of mosques or Muslim cemeteries. Perhaps the best known example of this is the 2010 case challenging county approval of building plans for a mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. According to the mosque opponents, Islam was not a religion, but rather a geopolitical system bent on instituting jihadist and Sharia law in America. Because Islam is not a religion, the argument went, the mosque construction plans not get to benefit from any of the county or federal laws that protect religious organizations. The Islamic Center Murfreesboro case was unique in that the arguments were actually made in court. But in just about every other scenario where a local Muslim community is trying to build or expand a mosque, they are faced with strong public backlash. Much of it centered on this idea of Islam not being a religion. My contacts at the Department of Justice have confirmed that this argument comes up in pretty much all of their mosque or Muslim cemetery cases. This is also the story I heard from Dawood Abu Diab, whose mosque in Columbia, Tennessee was firebombed. It's what I heard from Aya Zayed, who worked for years to push back against local opposition against a mosque in Montgomery, Alabama. And it is what the Muslim community in Farmersville, Texas faced when it tried to build a Muslim cemetery. In the Murfreesboro case, the judge permitted a 6-day hearing in which the plaintiff's attorney asked witnesses questions like this. Isn't it true that in the Quran, Muhammad had a 6-year-old wife that he had sex with? Is that your idea of what a religion is? Sharia law includes instruction on how to beat your wife. How is Sharia law going to affect our society, our jobs, and our freedoms? How can something be called a religion that promotes the abuse of women? Do you believe in having sex with children? These are the questions that were asked in a courtroom over the course of a 6-day hearing. The case literally put Islam on trial, and the DOJ had to file an amicus brief explaining that under the US Constitution and other federal laws, it is uncontroverted that Islam is a religion and a mosque is a place of religious assembly. The US Department of Justice had to actually make that argument in a court case. So another area where we see this argument that Islam is not a religion is it sort of undergirds efforts to prevent Muslim religious arbitration. Proponents call these measures anti-Sharia bills. They insist on the supposed threat of Sharia to American values, despite the fact that the American legal system has safeguards in place to resist excesses and abuses, the type of things American Muslims, like all Americans, are opposed to. So Sharia arbitration councils do exist in the US, but they operate in very limited areas within the broader legal system, usually family disputes, inheritance issues, and divorce proceedings, and are technically not courts of law. Sharia arbitration does not address criminal law issues, and they're very similar to religious arbitration in other faiths such as Judaism and Catholicism. And there are numerous safeguards and conditions placed on Sharia councils. For one, there must be voluntary participation from both parties. The arbitrator must be neutral. Parties have the right to choose which law governs a dispute. Once the process has begun, it can be terminated if both parties want to. A court must sign off on any decision for it to be legally binding. So the arbitrator can come to whatever decision, but in order to enforce it, you must have a civil secular court actually review it. And judgments are ultimately subject to the country's national law or public policy. That's one of the things that the civil court looks for. These safeguards have worked, and Sharia arbitration has not raised problems in the US. Despite this, there is a powerful movement to ban it. The first seeds were planted in January of 2006 when an attorney started a group called the Society of Americans for National Existence. On the group's website, he proposed a law that would make observing Sharia, which he compared to sedition, a felony punishable by 20 years in prison. And so to put this in context again, Sharia is just sort of like Islamic law that sort of governs the simplest, most minute parts of your religious worship. For example, how you would perform, how you cleanse yourself before you pray. And that's now, under this sort of movement, potentially a felony punishable by 20 years in prison. In the summer of 2009, the Society's founder began writing American Laws for American Courts, a model statute that would prohibit state judges from considering foreign laws or rulings that violate constitutional rights in the United States. Since then, his model legislation banning Sharia law has been virtually cut and pasted into bills considered and in some cases passed in numerous states. Since 2010, 201 anti-Sharia law bills have been introduced in 43 states. In 2017 alone, 14 states introduced an anti-Sharia law bill, with Texas and Arkansas enacting the legislation. Politicians at state and federal levels further perpetuate the mass hysteria created by the anti-Muslim organizations that push this legislation. In 2011, Tennessee State Senator Bill Ketchern introduced Senate Bill 1028, which gave the state attorney general authority to designate Sharia organizations, which it defined as two or more persons conspiring to support or acting in concert in support of Sharia or in furtherance of the imposition of Sharia within any state or territory of the United States. And anyone who provides material support or resources to this sort of organization could be charged with a felony and face up to 15 years in jail. So these preposterous arguments and legal efforts aside, Muslims also face legal hurdles to religious liberty in more subtle forms. In 2010, Professor Richard Schrager at the University of Virginia Law School argued that in today's politicized climate, the outcome of a case could be different merely if one switches out a Christian plaintiff for a Muslim one, with Christians more likely to win. As it turns out, empirical studies on judicial decision-making support his conclusion. There is evidence that Muslims, more than any other religious group, face biased judges. This reality can be hard to swallow because if there were ever a professional who needed to be neutral and objective, it would be a judge. Political preferences and religious affiliations should not affect a judge's decision-making, and neither should their preconceptions of a particular religion. But Islam appears to be testing the judiciary's commitment to impartiality. The researchers looked at all religious liberty cases, Muslim and otherwise, decided between 1996 and 2005, and found that Muslim claimants faced a marked disadvantage. Compared to non-Muslims, Muslims are half as likely to win the religious liberty case in federal court. The number shrinks further when it's a Muslim prisoner bringing the case, with Muslim prisoners succeeding only a third as often as non-Muslim prisoners. So what might account for this disadvantage? The researchers looked at a number of different theories, and they looked and dismissed, and I can't really go through them because I'm running out of time, but they looked at these theories and they were able to dismiss a number of them, and they reached the one conclusion that they thought was inevitable. Muslims are at a pronounced disadvantage because they are Muslim. The cases that these researchers examined involved a religious leader challenging some decision by the government, a decision that a public officer defends as necessary to American law and order. These types of cases trigger base stereotypes about Muslims or Islam. After all, a religious liberty claim by a Muslim puts Islam front and center. A judge may rule on the basis of these assumptions without even realizing it. The evidence shows the wider fear and distrust of Islam and Muslims as a threat to American values and safety infects judges too. Even if judges might try to avoid the constant negative news stream, Islam poses a particular challenge. The idea that Islam is not a religion is part and parcel of a broad attempt to carve out exceptions to religious liberty. Some Americans want really robust religious freedom for themselves, but do not want those rights to benefit Muslims. If they are successful in this carve-out, they will succeed in weakening religious liberty for all Americans, because that's how human rights work. Religious liberty for some is really religious liberty for none. Thank you.
Good morning to all of you. Let me preface my presentation with 4 points. One, first I need to thank the BYU, especially Cole, Gary, Brett, and for have invited us to participate in this particular forum. And of course I admire the center in my own particular way from a distance, and sometimes would like to just ask whether this center is not interested in perhaps setting up regional structures elsewhere. Of course, coming from Africa, sometimes I think a center such as this would be a fantastic idea in terms of gathering similar like-minded individuals who can't come to a forum such as this in the region, but also be located at one of the institutions in one of these regions. So just a thought. I want to mention that when thinking about law and religion and a number of other areas, particularly human dignity, we need to keep in mind contemporary scholars, those who have passed on, Hannah Arendt, those who are around, Sayla bin Habib, Emilio Garcia Sanchez, and we have Arundhati Roy and Amartya Sen. Why mentioning some of these individuals? Because of their contribution towards this important debate. However, I also would like us to recall earlier scholars such as St. Thomas Aquinas, Maimonides, and Al-Ghazali, who have also made their inputs, but who are sometimes left outside the debates. The third point I want to make is that some of the points that I'll be raising in my presentation connects with some of the thoughts that have already been presented yesterday, and so we will try to connect with them at particular points. And lastly, I would like to raise a question, in fact, basically two questions, but the one question is filled with more than one question, so to speak. How do we, not only in this forum, but sustain the freedom of religion or belief? How do we sustain this whole project into the next 10 years, in the next 20 years? And this in itself is a challenge. Why and in which way will we be able to do so? And then the next sort of question related to this, how do we, or what is the future of a project such as this 50 years down the line, the next generation when we know more? And I think this is a challenge that we need to sometimes always keep in mind. Having said that, let me come to my presentation. The focus is on fortification of dignity and human rights instruments, reflection of perspective within, and I put in brackets, African Muslim societies. In a sense, complementing to what Asma had just been sort of raising, partly within the American scenario, but we would like to look at the African continent largely, but more specifically to the region from where I come. So I'll divide my paper into more or less 4 sections. One will be quickly revisiting some of those very concepts that we have already looked at, and then we will look specifically at Africa itself, broadly speaking, and then come to Southern Africa that I will comment on, and then specifically look 1 to 2 or 3 case studies that I would like to just raise as a way of highlighting the nature of freedom of religion or belief, and of course in relation to the notion of dignity. So I've prepared a number of slides, but I'll fleetingly go through some, pause on others, and then make my comment. But of course, during the question period, you may ask some of them. Let me sort of start by saying that when we think about the connection, I think we more or less think about this tripartite relationship that exists. Of course, yesterday we heard in one panel talking about human dignity being sort of the grounding, so to speak, of human rights. And of course, we also heard the definition of religion as being that of the common good. So bearing these definitions in mind, and earlier and the discussions of yesterday, we sort of just need to recollect and try to connect them. But again, I'm not going to sort of go into all of these. But yesterday we also heard that human dignity itself is a slippery concept. And then some have also commented on that the notion of human rights in itself is also a slippery concept. So we're basically sitting with a number of slippery concepts. So we need to be careful whether we'll be slipping by or slipping on them, or basically be able to come up with something that we can at least stand on. Having said that, again, I'm not going to go through sort of all the points that we make in each of these slides, because there are a number of them, but of course when we talk about the doctrine of human rights, we have also heard yesterday it has been derived from sort of natural law, and of course the post-World War period, we have noted a number of theologians, philosophers, and legal theorists having come up. And of course one of the noted individuals whom we have mentioned earlier, Hannah Arendt, basically makes an interesting contribution in this regard. So let's go to An-Naim, who basically made the following. He observed that the implementation of international human rights norms in any society requires thoughtful and well-informed engagement with religion broadly defined. Why? Of course, my question, because of its strong influence on human beliefs and behavior. and also that religious considerations are too important for the majority of people, for human rights scholars and advocates to continue to dismiss them simply as irrelevant, insignificant, or problematic. Of course, the Oxford Dictionary, coming now to the notion of religion, basically says religion as the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. Others basically say, well, it's a system of faith and worship, and another says a pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance. So we're not going to unpack this. I think most of you are familiar with sort of these definitions, but I just sort of mentioning them here so that we can sort of see the connection with coming back to sort of the notion of human dignity. So the lines that basically exist. Historically, law and religion have been constituted and constantly transformed, and that is still, all of us are involved in this process where we see the transformation taking place all the time. And of course, natural religious law, a law driven from a faith in God or in divine forces, morality and legality are embedded in religion. So there's this interconnectedness that we need to bear in mind. Going to the UN Declaration, basically, we of course talk about freedom of speech, importantly, freedom of religion. Now, coming to the third concept, we made mention early on of Sailor Ben Habib, and this is a very important work maybe to consult when one talks about the notion of dignity. And then there's a book that's written on Hannah Arendt and the fragility of human dignity, interesting issues that one can look at. But let us go back to where our keynote speaker discussed, well, she mentioned our Nelson Mandela, who basically made a number of statements, and I just share with you some of the quotes. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. And he says in the other, to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. Let's go to Gandhi. Human dignity demands courage to defend oneself. So, dignity is the right person to be valued and respected for their own sake, person to be treated ethically, significant in morality, ethics, law, and politics. So dignity as an extension of the Enlightenment era concepts of inherent, inalienable rights. But let's come to Martin Luther King. What did he say? All labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance and should be undertaken with painstaking excellence. We heard the word excellence yesterday, so all of these connect with the earlier discussions. Let's go to Malcolm X. The goal is the dignity of the black man. Of course, one can take away the word black man and say human beings all over the globe. The person wants respect as a human being, and the person wants recognition as a human being. So it applies to what we had been talking about. So the advocates of dignity then, the common sense response is dignity is about respect. That is the sort of underlying. Arundhati Roy basically made another interesting remark. At a time when opportunism is everything, when hope seems lost, when everything boils down to a cynical business deal, we have heard of corporate companies, an issue that I would like to also have questioned. We must find the courage to dream, to reclaim romance, the romance of believing in justice, in freedom, and in dignity for everybody. So, having sort of made mention of made reference to some of these important figures, let's sort of come more to specifics. Dignity then as a core value. Values speak to the fundamental belief that every individual deserves to be treated with humanity and compassion, respecting the inherent value and worth of each human being, working with others, with other people who support common values and vision to reach and achieve shared goals. So when we think about this value, that is dignity, we think of it as an important principle. On one hand, the principle of morality, on the other, as a principle of law. And they are interconnected in different ways. And having sort of picked this from Google, some of the other points too, though. Human dignity is the most important human right from which all other fundamental rights derive. So we then bear that in mind, and we connect with what Professor Lindholm and others basically discussed yesterday, that when we think about dignity, dignity basically is a foundation of rights as such. So that in itself, of course, has been debated. It remains to be debated, but I think it's important. And this particular slide just reinforces the point made in the previous one. But let's go to the Muslim world. And we basically bear in mind these particular definitions, but also raise questions. To what extent is human dignity really protected within the Muslim world? We've seen the Saudis bombarding the Yemenis to smithereens. When we ask, where's the human rights of those people? They're very neighbors. They share the common sort of religious identity, but theologically they differ because the one group within the Yemenites are Shia and the other are Sunni, so therefore it's an intra-Muslim affair. But this intra-Muslim affair, as we all know, has spilled over into other regions, whether in Iraq, whether Syria, and even Muslim minorities, and I'll come back to that when we deal with Southern Africa. So when we look at the Muslim world itself, let me quickly just give some of us an idea. Of course, many of you are familiar with this, but just to sort of help us to get an understanding of the notion of Sharia itself. Again, the word Sharia has an etymology which I don't want to go into, but basically how it is understood by contemporary Muslims. There is an individual by the name of Sheikh Muhammad Abu Zahra. In his text entitled Usul al-Fiqh, he basically made the point that Sharia basically should be viewed as a mercy to humanity. So in other words, he sees the notion of Sharia in a very broad sense, bearing in mind what Asma just basically mentioned in terms of those who have took anti-Muslim stance and the way they understand. So one tries to understand why they basically respond in this way. It demonstrates itself in achieving three major goals. This is of Sharia according to Abu Zahra. It nurtures a righteous individual. So who has qualms with that? Secular law too wants a righteous or moral, ethically minded individual. It establishes justice. So has anybody got qualms with Sharia establishing justice? So there is this connection. And thirdly, it realizes sort of benefits. And of course, this is the third dimension. But again, as we say that, depending upon how we take, how we appropriate, how we understand, how we engage with it, that's perhaps where the debate has been. But let me come to what they called in the Muslim legal system as the maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of Muslim law. And the underlying understanding of the objective of the Muslim law is basically the welfare of everyone across religious ties, in other words, traditions. Now, of course, again, Muslims are to be blamed for sometimes appropriating their very own system to basically defend their own particular cases. But interestingly, importantly, is to safeguard the individual or community's faith, protect the individual community's existence, shield the individual community's intellect and mind, and then guard the individual's community's dignity through posterity or generations, and defend the individual and community's wealth or property. Now, of course, again, I can unpack these, but the point of the matter is they are important to bear in mind when we think about this. Now, the OIC, or Organization of Islamic Conference, now known as Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which I don't know what the technical difference has been because they're still the same. They haven't really moved an inch in terms of their even response to the notion of human dignity, if I may say so. Anyhow, I'm not going to go into that because of time. I was just given an indication that my time has already moved on, so I'm going to skip a number, but quickly, briefly indicate to you, why did they come up with their own charters, so to speak, when there's a UN declaration, is the question. So I'll sort of just leave that hanging there as a sort of question. So we find some of these charters having been charted out. The Cairo Declaration on Human Rights basically is a declaration of the members of the OIC. It provides an overview on the Muslim perspective on human rights. So one would like to probe that further. And this particular declaration, Cairo 1, declares its purpose to be general guidance for OIC members. So what about non-OIC members regarding this issue? And so one can go on. So I'm not going to go because of the time. I'd like to just mention this particular one. In the post-Iranian Revolution scenario, we have Saeed Rajai Khorasani having stated that the declaration as document was a relativistic, secular understanding of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So, a document that could not be implemented by Muslims without trespassing Muslim law. So one has to debate as to why he basically had this understanding and saw the declaration somewhat through different lenses and understood it very differently. But let me come to Africa quickly. Again, Africa, of course, also has its own human charter and the Charter on Human Rights and People's Rights. And so we're not going to go into that, but what Article 8 basically says, freedom of conscience and profession and free practice of religion shall be guaranteed. Now, of course, when we look at our continent, it's vast, it's multicultural, it's multi-religious, it is multilingual, it is multi-ethnic. In other words, it is just a vibrant continent. It's a continent that sometimes it has been described as a country. In some forums they say, oh, Africa, as if it's another country. Not realizing, but Africa is far from that. Nonetheless, what I want to point out more is that because Africa in itself has become the home of the major religious traditions, Christianity and Islam, as we know, as this particular map somewhat indicates, but not overlooking the fact that African religious tradition is also vibrant and still very much present within the heart of the continent itself. But again, we're not sort of going to go to that. But just to give you some stats, this sort of gives you some ideas of the spread. Now let me come to Southern Africa where I am and of course try to conclude and just mentioning one or two of the case studies. Southern Africa itself is a very interesting region. SADC, the Southern African Development Community, of course changed its name earlier to this particular name. But what I want to say is that generally speaking, the notion of democracy is very prevalent in most of the states. And they normally elect the governments into power, but more specifically the constitution that they have, all of them basically guarantee freedom of religion. And that in itself is important. And because of that, many of the minority religions today, let alone the majority, because majority is Christianity, let alone leaving that aside, the minorities have enjoyed the freedom of movement, of expression, of belief, of practice that Muslim countries do not enjoy, if you get what we are saying. You go to Saudi Arabia, I'm not trying to pin Saudi Arabia down, but Saudi Arabia has been one of the key contributors to the mayhem that we basically find, but be that as it may. Because of, if anyone disagrees theologically, jurisprudentially on issues, you will find yourself basically muzzled. But let me then quickly I want to also just mention when you talk about Southern Africa, there is a concept known as Ubuntu that is so critical that might not necessarily have influenced the religious minorities themselves, but the religious minorities have realized that this particular concept is very much operative. But of course, contemporary Southern African Muslim, not Muslim, but South African communities do not necessarily sort of observe this particular concept, but it's a very powerful and important concept. It basically says the following, that I'm just looking for the other phrase. So it basically says a person is a person through other persons. And that is in how you need to connect with one another. This dignity, that respect, that tolerance, that acceptance. And that in itself has been a challenge. Leaving aside that particular concept and connecting it to the Muslims itself have, of course, have been around. Again, I know my time is basically gone, but let me just say this. All religious communities are led by a group known as the ulama. I don't like to use translate that word ulama. I prefer to translate it as theologians, not as learned scholars, for a number of reasons. I'm not going to go into that. But what I would like to say is that they are the ones to appropriate the understanding of what is meant in the Quran. You heard the judge yesterday giving a translation of how it has been interpreted and making reference to one of the scholars. And that is, of course, where we find the differences coming. So, having said that, let me quickly just make this. All of them, that is most of these individuals who are these gatekeepers of the House of Islam, they come from seminaries, either in South Asia, known as the Darul Ulooms, or they come from Muslim universities, such as your International University Medina, where they basically are taught certain doctrines, and of course sometimes, for me, from my understanding, indoctrinated in their thinking. Instead of being critical and thinking out of the box and beyond the box, they only think in the box, if they can think, and if they do think. And this is where the challenge has been. So, let me quickly just come to two case studies, just mention in brief, and then I end. Interestingly, in Zimbabwe and South Africa, two neighboring states, as you can see from this map, or the maps there, both countries have the freedom of religion. And I just want to mention quickly, there's a Mufti Menk. A Mufti means somebody who has been licensed to give a fatwa, a legal opinion, which was mentioned by Professor Lundholm yesterday. And so this Mufti Menk is a Zimbabwean, born and bred in Harare, and of course become fairly well known as such. And he spoke on this concept of respect and dignity. And he's been participating in this program known as Building Bridges. Most of you are familiar with this particular project that is ongoing at the moment. But I'm not going to go into the other point, but I want to come to the last one, South Africa. And this particular pic basically doesn't tell much, but let me just quickly explain and end. In South Africa, the debate has been raging as to the rights of gays and lesbians, not only South Africa, of course, Africa as a continent, but specifically in sort of South Africa, this came up. And why did this come up? Because the fellow on your left, my left, your left too, his name is Mohsin Hendricks. He openly came up that he is gay. He's an imam. He taught at the madrasa, and he basically proclaimed himself to be imam. And as a result of that, he was challenged by a Mufti known as Mufti AK, or Hoosen. And Mufti AK is sort of the roving Mufti for a radio station known as Channel Islam International, which is based in Johannesburg. And they basically debated this issue. I'm not going to go into it, you can always ask me about it. But what I also want to add quickly about this particular Mufti is that he has been very anti-Shia. Now, in South African scenario, Shia communities have mushroomed, and at the moment, as we speak, they just apprehended about 21 or 19 individuals who were implicated in a bombing and the killing of somebody at a Shia mosque in Durban, outside Durban. So what this tells us is that internally, these muftis have used their position to also counter the other theological group. And the question that we have, and basically end with this, is what do they understand by freedom of religion? What do they understand by freedom of expression? What do they understand by freedom of association? It appears that they seem to appropriate their circumstances in which we all are experiencing that freedom as Muslims, as Hindus, as Jews, as Christians, as people from all different denominations within Christianity. South Africa as a country has never imposed its will on any. When Madiba stepped in as the first democratic president of the country, he basically had an imam, a rabbi, somebody from African tradition to basically bless his installment. The point which I want to make is that here are these individuals who basically articulate a position that is diametrically opposed to the Constitution itself. Yet, they have not been taken to task. But internally, they want to move along as if they are the gatekeepers and the interpreters of the House of Islam. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I was scheduled to speak yesterday afternoon, but Ganoon Diop had a change in his travel schedule, and so we swapped times. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you and to share some thoughts about the theme of human dignity for everyone, everywhere. This, as a theme, arose in large measure due to the experience of Jan Figel, who we've heard from here, who in his role as a special envoy for freedom of religion and belief outside the European Union has experiences like this. He calls up Pakistan, says, "Hello, Pakistan, this is Jan Figel, the EU special envoy for freedom of religion and belief outside the EU, and I'd like to come talk." And they say, "We're pretty busy." But they then politely ask, "What do you want to talk about?" And he says, "Well, I'd like to come talk about the idea of human dignity and how it's important to all people and how it should apply to all places and all times." And they say, "Well, we're Muslims and the idea of karama is central to our theology, and human dignity is something we believe in deeply. Why don't you come?" And they start a conversation. And based upon this, Jan has now been back to Pakistan 3 or 4 times and is entering into broader and deeper conversations about human rights. So we have had the idea that as we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10th this year, to create a gathering of scholars and people who are interested in human rights to reflect upon the various ways in which human dignity is a useful concept in the field of human rights. And we'll be gathering in Punta del Este in Uruguay at the beginning of December, and we will be hopefully creating a consensus document which will help in the process of seeking to re-energize, recommit, reaffirm, and also to some extent depoliticize and perhaps detribalize human rights. And what I would like to do today is simply to introduce you to this project and to ask you for your feedback and critique, because it's still in draft form. A few of my slides have disappeared. Let me tell you a little bit about the background and basis for this. We begin by noting that 70 years ago, in the aftermath of World War II, the nations and peoples of the world came together in solidarity and solemnity and unanimously adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, calling it a common standard of achievement of all people and for all nations. It begins by declaring the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, that this is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And Article 1 of the UDHR proclaims all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, that they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. This idea of human dignity for everyone everywhere is the foundational idea of human rights and reminds us that every person has great value and is worthy of great respect. We also remember, reaffirm, and recommit ourselves to these basic ideas. The Declaration then recalls a number of important realities. The first is that it was profound violations of human dignity during the wars of the 20th century that preceded and precipitated the UDHR. That despite all of their differences, the nations of the world rallied around the idea of human dignity as the basic foundation of human rights and of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. As well, that human dignity is the wellspring of civil and political rights, as well as social and cultural and economic rights. Also recalling that the UDHR has served as the basis for most of the constitutions and most of the declarations of rights that exist in constitutions around the world today. Also recognizing the severe violations of human dignity that continue in our day, including wars, genocides, forced migrations, the global crisis of refugees and asylum seekers. Recognizing also that human rights can easily be fragmented, eroded, or neglected, and that constant vigilance is necessary to implement and realize them, to carry them forward into the world. Recognizing also that the human dignity of everyone everywhere is threatened when the needs, interests, and rights of one group are placed ahead of those of other groups or individuals, or when one right is given preference over others. The Declaration also emphasizes that human dignity is a status with which all human beings are born, but also a value that must be learned and lived, and emphasizing that violations, whether large or small, of human dignity deserve appropriate redress. Emphasizing also that human dignity is now a time-tested principle that can help find common ground, reconcile competing conceptions of justice, facilitate implementation of human rights, and guide adjudication in cases of conflict. We then have 12 observations or points of declaration. And I want to just review these briefly with you, because this is the primary text of this proposed declaration that we would encourage and welcome your feedback. I'm happy to provide you with the written draft so you can give us your suggestions. The first point is this. Human dignity plays different roles in human rights. It is at once the foundational idea of human rights, but it's also the objective or the goal. So when we're trying to figure out how to implement human rights, we can ask the question, does this foster and further human dignity? It is also a criteria for evaluating government actions. When we ask the question, is a government violating human rights, we can usefully ask the question, what is their action doing to human dignity? Protecting human dignity of everyone within its jurisdiction is the fundamental obligation of states and the key to protecting the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Point 2 is that human dignity can be useful in generating agreement and building common consensus. As we've gone back and really studied the drafting of the Human Rights Declaration, one thing that is very evident is that the statesmen and stateswomen who did this were not starry-eyed idealists. They had come through the crucibles of World War I and World War II. They knew the inhumanity that man could meet upon men, and they were committed to the idea that this should never happen again. And they were looking for common ideas that could be used to build consensus, because after all, it was consensus that created the primary justification for human rights. It was the consensus of the nations of the world coming together unanimously to adopt it. So we believe that human dignity for everyone everywhere is a point of departure, a way of finding common ground, and a way of building bridges. It's not that everyone is going to agree about the exact meaning or implications of human dignity, but with a shared concept, we can begin a shared conversation. Number 3, human dignity for everyone everywhere helps us define and understand the meaning and scope of other human rights, including political and social and economic rights. The idea here, I think, was well illustrated by Ann Power Ford's lecture on Sunday evening, where very specific problems were being considered, problems of conscience, problems of prisoners, problems of refugees. And what her experience teaches is that the idea of human dignity can help us think about these specific human rights issues in ways that are sensitive and careful. Not that they generate only one outcome. She was very careful to say that you may disagree about the specific applications. The point was something different, not that it is an algorithm for generating outcomes in cases, but rather that it is a principle that helps us focus on the right questions. And we think she's right about that. 4, human dignity for everyone everywhere helps us emphasize the underdeveloped concept in the UDHR that rights include accompanying responsibilities, not just of states, but of right holders, and for those of us who are trying to respect the rights of others. The concept of duties is present in the UDHR, but it's muted. And we think that the idea of human dignity for everyone everywhere helps us focus on duties as well, because of the emphasis of everyone everywhere. Those are universalizing concepts which make it impossible for us to focus only on our rights. And when we stop focusing only on our rights, we begin focusing on others' rights and our duties with respect to their rights. Number 5, human dignity for everyone everywhere, we believe, is an idea that can help depoliticize or perhaps even detribalize human rights. The reality is, in today's world, there are a variety of voices of skepticism about human rights, and they come from a variety of viewpoints. Our thought is that by returning to fundamentals, returning to basics, returning to this basic idea of human dignity, we can help create responses to some of those voices of skepticism. Not that they're going to disappear, not that they're going to be defeated by argument alone, but they're going to be countered, we think, by sensitive and thoughtful and deep responses. Number 6, human dignity for everyone everywhere helps us understand that the best basis for implementing human rights is going to be through teaching and education. This is clearly stated in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As we've discussed, the UDHR was not a legally binding instrument. It was a common standard of achievement for all people in all places, that through keeping this idea in front of us and by teaching it, it would enter the hearts and minds of the peoples of the world. Over time, human rights has come to be viewed more narrowly legalistically. And we think the emphasis on human dignity for everyone everywhere helps remind us that the most powerful institution for implementing human rights is going to be homes, families, and schools, mothers, fathers, and teachers teaching important values such as human dignity and respect for all to their children. Number 7, we believe human dignity for everyone everywhere makes it more difficult for advocates and opponents of human rights or of specific rights to be rigid in advocating for one right to the exclusion of others or for one group to the exclusion of others. One thing we see increasingly in the human rights world are special interest advocacy, and these surely have their place. I could be considered a special interest advocate because I'm especially concerned about the human right of freedom of religion and belief for all people. But human rights are interdependent, interconnected. They exist together. They will rise or fall together. And one thing that human dignity for everyone everywhere does is help us keep that in mind. Number 8, human dignity for everyone everywhere is a key to protecting human rights and to the mutual vindication of multiple rights. Number 9, reconciling and adjudicating. Human dignity for everyone everywhere is an important constitutional and legal principle for adjudicating and reconciling competing rights, as well as claims between human rights and other important national and societal interests, such as national security. There are many places in the world where human dignity has been used very effectively as a jurisprudential principle. I'm thinking in particular of the European Court of Human Rights, the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and the German Constitutional Court. Number 10, human dignity for everyone everywhere helps avoid the distortion, instrumentalization, and avoidance and abuse of human rights by government and non-state actors. What we see today is sometimes human rights are distorted or instrumentalized or avoided. Our view is when states and the rest of us are reminded that what human rights is really about is human dignity for everyone everywhere, it makes it more difficult for them to engage in these various forms of maneuver. Number 11 is dignitary harm and identity politics. Human dignity for everyone everywhere helps us evaluate claims involving dignitary harm, the right to not be offended, and other forms of identity politics. Identity politics is based on the idea that we are different, and it is our differences that are important, and that the special needs and rights I have are based upon my specific differences. Now, again, there's element of important truth to this. Sometimes people have been discriminated against or even persecuted because of their differences, and those differences may result in the need for specific redress. But what human dignity for everyone everywhere reminds us is that more important than our differences is what makes us the same, and that is our common and shared humanity, and that is something that overcomes the identitarian differences without needing to diminish or undermine those differences. What we remember is that in spite of those differences, there are other things that are very important that are shared. Finally, human dignity for everyone everywhere reminds us to focus our attention on the most egregious human rights abuses, those who are most likely to suffer human rights violations. One thing we've been reminded of here in this forum this week is that there are still places where egregious violations of human rights are not merely theoretical matters. It's easy for us as scholars to get together and get into very highly theoretical and abstract conceptual arguments, but we live in a world where people are dying because their basic rights of human dignity are not being protected. So, if this resonates with you at all, if this seems interesting to you, we are going to be inviting people of the world to sign and join this declaration. But because it's still in draft form, we now also invite your feedback and reflection to how we can improve and perfect the draft. What we need is ideas to make it shorter, not longer, to make it simpler rather than more verbose. But this list of 12 is actually a consolidation of what began as a list of 40. So we have been working hard on this, trying to encapsulate in simple and forceful ways the important idea of human dignity for all people in all places. Thank you.
We want to thank each of our panelists today for their extraordinary contribution to the dialogue of this symposium. I think I speak for all of us when I say I wish we had a lot more time now to be able to debate and discuss each of these presentations and the points that have been made. Unfortunately, this is a rather short session, and we're just finishing now. Our time is spent, and we need to take a break and then move on to the other sessions. But I would really like to invite each of you who've been impressed by these presentations to discuss with the speakers the various points of view, and please take the invitation from Professor Scharfs to review the document, which we will have available for you, and discuss the process and think about how we can improve this document. And again, I hope you will join with me now in thanking all of our panelists once more for their extraordinary contributions.